Wonderful. And hello to old friends, colleagues, and new friends who are joining the webinar today. I'm really excited to talk to you about my courses and to let you know more about, what I do. As Ryan mentioned, well, let me say a little bit more about myself in terms of my specific areas of expertise. So my main area of focus is American philosophy and pragmatism. So that's the philosophy of people like William James, Jane Addams, John Dewey. These were turn of the century figures, not only in philosophy, but in progressive politics. They also did a lot with regards to, influencing the emerging social sciences of sociology and psychology. And so this is part of the reason why I've been a professor of applied ethics throughout most of my career, because the pragmatists, well, pragmatism is, doing things that are practical. They thought philosophy should be put to work. And so with applied ethics, that gives me the opportunity to use philosophy to help us think about these really wicked, concrete social problems that we're facing. And my work in courses on philosophy of sports, philosophy of war, and philosophy of sex and love are kind of examples of this, and like helping students to have the critical thinking and communication tools they need, as well as the knowledge of the history of philosophy to engage those problems sufficiently. I've also been an online instructor for well over 10 years. And while many of us are, coming to online instruction, because of the pandemic and the massive shift we've had to make, it's been a really rewarding for me to be able to help out my colleagues at my home university and other friends with making this transition. And so I'm really grateful that Kendall Hunt is providing me the opportunity today to talk a little bit about my pedagogy and curriculum and how I organize material online so that students can, get an excellent education and engage in these subject matters. So, what are the problems that we're facing? Well, Ryan did a really good job of presenting that in his introduction of me. We're in an increasingly polarized world, and there have always been political divisions, but over the 15 years that I've been teaching in the Pacific Northwest, I've seen this increase more and more. Certainly since the 2016 election and the emergence of fake news and propaganda that's been able to spread like wildfire due to social media. So, even before the popularization of social media, what I found students really loved about philosophy was that it empowered them with these tools to think for themselves and the critical thinking tools that they needed to be able to sort out, is this a credible news source? Is this a valuable article? Is this survey or research relevant to these particular challenging problems? So most of what my work has been is not only teaching them the theoretics with regards to ethics, things like consequentialism and virtue ethics and whatnot, but teaching them how to do these critical thinking skills when it comes to these ethical problems, because none of us are really neutral in this regard. While we can be kind of a part of the loyal opposition and sort of kind to one another and thinking about ideas, we all have, very deeply held beliefs about these issues. But that doesn't mean at the same time that we can't be objective, that there aren't these sort of universal tools that we can teach and learn to have and use to, if not come to some consensus, at least some convergence about, what is a good argument on this subject, what ideas are just like total conspiracy theories and have no evidence or proof like grounding them in any ways. Where the really difficult issues lie, that it may just be a conflict of values. We may agree that the facts are the same, but because you share certain deeply held beliefs and I share other ones, we may never fully agree on this one. Or, maybe the best answer to a certain problem hasn't emerged yet. And so part of what we need to do in a democratic society is regain that sense of the loyal opposition. And, how do we have constructive conversations about ethical controversies that are actually constructive and help us to, actually become closer to people we disagree with. You know, some of my best friends are people I have radically different points of view with, and that's a good thing. We need more of that now, not less. And the reason for all of this is there's a great deal of despair out there. Students are often coming into the university, thinking that there is no such thing as truth. It's only opinion. It's just a power play of who can kind of shout the loudest. Social media can be a great thing, right? But it's ultimately a popularity contest where who wins a debate is the one that gets the most likes or shares, or just doesn't get the most critical memes kind of thrown out against them, right? To sort of joke about and undermine their position. And the thing I find more and more is that really what philosophy can do in the 21st century is help us to overcome that degree of despair, right? Some things may still remain subjective. We may not come to an agreement, but if we can have those critical, constructive conversations, there's something empowering about that. And we can help find the shared humanity in one another. And, at least ameliorate our social problems if we can't solve them. So how do we do this? Well, in the course, I find the most important ways to do this is first and foremost to use as diverse an array of articles by people who have different points of view, but also ones who come from different backgrounds and lineages and have different perspectives. I mean, representation is crucially important. All of us have certain implicit biases that we're not even aware of. And so it's really crucial, especially at the university level, that we get exposed to, writings by people who may come from different races, religion, nationality, ethics, sexual or gender identities, and see the world differently from us, right? And we all ultimately benefit from that. Also, as we've noticed due to the pandemic, the desire for quality online curriculum is higher now than ever. I think a lot of us have experienced both the good and the bad of online education at this point. And we're beginning to see, for some classes and some courses and ideas, or at least some presentation, online format's really great, right? And we want to do more of that in the future, not less of that in the future. It's not that face-to-face classes are ever going away. I'm a big believer that we need both. But I also recognize that instructors need like quality curriculum and courses, right, that help them to be able to meet their curricular goals with their students. And finally, so many of us need effective writing support for our students. Where I teach, my applied ethics courses are part of our general ed curriculum. So communication is a very important goal that all of us have to teach with these courses. And so, making sure that students have not only the abilities to reason well, but also the abilities to communicate, to compose their own arguments, and not to engage in just persuasion, but to present credible evidence and facts in a logically coherent argument. I mean, this is a much needed skill that you constantly hear employers asking for, but more importantly, we need for our democracy and the quality of our society. So how do I do this in my classes? Well, kind of linking to the title of this presentation, I really try to think about 3 questions that I want every student to ask themselves, repeatedly throughout the term with regards to, that are very philosophical. Who am I? What do I believe? And why do I believe it, right? College is this time where, as young adults, we get to really explore who we are and figure out what our identity is. And this is very relevant to the subjects of sports, the military, and our gender and sexual identities, right? I mean, sports is such an important part of our lives, not just for our physical health, but also for our emotional, our social, and even our psychological self, because so much of our identity from a young age comes from the sports that we're involved in, right? So many of us will identify ourselves as, I'm a basketball player, or I'm a dancer, or I'm a swimmer, right? Because the sports that we perform, they don't just condition our minds, they condition our sense of ourselves. And so we develop a lot of our character and our ethical framework from this. We develop discipline, we develop teamwork, we develop a sense of fairness and playing by the rules. We learn how to be a good sport when we win or when we lose, right? Um, so sports is really this important place for us to think about our identity. Likewise, many college students are either considering going into the military or perhaps are veterans and entering into higher education after having this really exceptional human experience of being at war and experiencing combat, right? And so thinking about what it means to be a veteran, thinking about what it means to be a civilian, and having classes where these two groups that are actually very separated in our modern societies can come together and share experience is another thing that is incredibly crucial. And finally, there's nothing more important for our identity than the relationships that we're involved in. Our relationships are our greatest teachers, and these include our romantic and our sexual relationships as well. So as young adults living on our own for the first time, students are constantly thinking about, these questions regarding their sexual orientation, their gender identities, and they need some kind of source for understanding this in a more sophisticated and thorough way. It's not that YouTube and TikTok can't provide some of this information, but there's certainly like more thoughtful pieces out there that we also want our young people to be encountering too, as they're trying to make these decisions for themselves. But even in more mundane philosophical subjects, this is why it's important to provide a wide variety of readings and topics and videos for students, because students need to feel that they are represented within the curriculum, that it's not just, sadly, guys with beards like me who are telling them what the world is like, but that they're encountering, right, these other sources from people who have perspectives that are more like them. And so in my courses, I try to use a wide range of works from people of different backgrounds, different cultures, but also historical sources as well as contemporary ones, right? And you can see this in a lot of my particular work. So here's just a list of the different topics that I cover in my courses. So in philosophy of sports, they're learning Western philosophy like the ancient Greek Stoics, but I also have a section on yoga, right? Where they get a sense of a more holistic way of thinking about the mind, body, and spirit. We talk about the issues of ability and disability, how that's relevant to context. We also talk about gender inclusion and social justice, and I'll have an example of that coming up. So I'll say more about that then. In philosophy of war, we start off actually looking at non-Western sources for how to think about the warrior experience. So we read the Bhagavad Gita from Hinduism and look at these notions of dharma and duty that are essential to that culture, but also that particular way of thinking about what it means to be a warrior. We look at Bushido from Japan and the code of the samurai, right? But also more contemporary, we look at things like PTSD, and Stoicism. We also consider new emerging technologies like cyber warfare or the increased use of mercenaries that are going on. And finally, in the philosophy of sex and love, we start with the historical source of Plato's Symposium to show how a lot of our ideas about gender and sexuality are very socially constructed and related to our particular cultures we find ourselves in. But we also read a lot of contemporary sources by trans feminists. Students encounter indigenous views on two-spirit persons, as well as a variety of global perspectives on monogamy, as well as non-monogamous forms of relationship like polyamory. Then by encountering so much of this, it allows students to have the opportunity of really deciding for themselves what they believe. And the way to do this is through discussion. It's through sharing these ideas with their peers and hearing their peers' points of view. And I have found that this is best done through discussions of relevant case studies. I mean, these ethical ideas do make up essential parts of our identity. And, nobody wants to get into the discussion about things that are so personal. But if you have a good case study, of where someone else is grappling with this issue, or certain arguments are being presented for or against a certain idea, that gives kind of the emotional distance and space for students to share their different perspectives and to learn from each other about these particular issues. So just to give you an example, in module 7 of my philosophy of sports class, the case study discussion is, should we stop classifying athletes by gender, right? And this is a very pressing topic. I mean, we have the Olympics coming up next month. Really glad that those are going to be going on again. But, across the country, states are really grappling with, the issue of trans athletes. And, sadly, there have been several bills signed banning trans athletes participation. Now, I want to stress that in all of my courses, and especially in this one, in this discussion, whether or not it's okay to be trans or for trans people to participate in sports is never up for discussion. I don't ever have to defend my particular sexual or gender identity, and I just feel it's wrong to make students have to defend their particular gender or sexual identity. So I try to maintain, a very trans and queer positive environment in my courses and my curriculum, so that all students feel safe to express themselves and be who they are. So what this is discussing is, well, it basically assumes that trans athletes should have the right to engage in sports. I don't really feel it's ethical to entertain another possibility there. Sports are so essential for our personal development. Why shouldn't any student be able to participate in sports? That being said, I mean, there are some ethical concerns about the way for this to occur fairly. And it brings us back to a lot of sort of the essential meta-ethical questions of philosophy of sports, like fairness, ability, as well as social justice and inclusion. So in this case study, we read an article, it's listed down there, by Torben Tanasjo, where he actually makes the very bold claim, and this is from like 10 or 15 years ago, that we should just do away with gender segregation in sports entirely, right? And that it should be based on what sports are always based on, which is ability and who is the best at performing certain sports and tasks. Now, that's a controversial issue, and we thoroughly discussed the fact that women's sports are important and the rich history of that. So how do we protect kind of the integrity of those traditions, right? But it does help us to think more deeply about these other issues. Another case study that's part of that is Caster Semenya, who is an Olympic track and field star. She has dominated competition so much that some people began questioning her biological gender identity. And it actually turns out that, she shouldn't have had to go through this much of an invasive process to prove it. But she is biologically female. However, she has a high amount of natural testosterone in her body. So she wasn't doping or cheating or being unfair in any way. She's just born in a body that has certain advantages. But what elite athlete isn't born in a body that has certain advantages? But nevertheless, this has caused the Olympic committees to think more deeply about, how do we define what is male or female with regards to Olympic competitions? And finally, there's a case of powerlifter J.C. Cooper, who is a trans woman and was very conscientious about following the guidelines that her amateur powerlifting competition set forward for trans athletes to participate fairly. But nevertheless, she was denied participating. And I mean, that's clearly an ethical violation. If we're going to have rules for participation, we should be following them. But by finding these really good case studies, by providing students with articles on these particular issues, by giving them in the overviews some of the basic nomenclature of the difference between orientation, gender identity, what it means for it to be socially constructed versus biological, students are able to share with their peers their points of view on this issue and engage in some really thoughtful discussions of them. And finally, the way we kind of complete the circle here is not just students getting a chance to encounter different ideas to shape their identity or to sort of figure out what they believe through this sharing with their peers, but to finally, through a research project, through a writing project, to articulate what they actually believe. And one of the ways I do this in my courses is through scaffolded process of independent research and peer review. So each module has, in each week, they do a different part of the research process. So week 1 is finding a topic. Week 2 is finding sources. And then finally in week 4, I have them do a proposal and abstract. So let me say something specifically about this one. I find this is one of the best ways to really improve the quality of students' writing during a term, because let's face it, I've always suffered with procrastination. And I know a lot of students wait until 4 days before a paper is due to actually start working on it. That's why I have these workshop assignments, because in week 4, they have to give me a proposal and an abstract with their thesis statement of, tentatively what they are going to do their paper on. This kind of helps me to make some course correction early on. And it ensures that they're thinking about what they want to do. They're already starting to find sources, and they're getting things they need on interlibrary loan or making the trip to the library to gain that. It just ensures that they're doing the work of writing a paper rather than just staring at a blank word processor for 10 weeks until the 11th hour has come and they must put something down. But writing is an essential part of higher education. It is how we learn to articulate our beliefs. It is part of the thinking process of evaluating our sources and trying to put our beliefs together in a way that we can communicate to others. And so by doing that, I really think this helps the students in my applied ethics course to have a very rich encounter, not just with philosophy, but thinking about these ethical issues and how they apply to their lives. So to just provide an overview, each one of my courses uses the same format to maximize time with students. There's usually 9 different modules. I like to give them the last week of class to actually work on their paper. It starts with an introduction where a lot of the basic facts or ideas of the topic get laid out. Then they usually do 4 conceptual topics, which are kind of broad ideas like justice or fairness or what is love or something like that. And then it moves to those applied ethics topics, which are the concrete problems we deal with, like cyber warfare, like gender inclusion in sports, etc. And then each module, each week, I try to use the same pedagogical features to help students, especially in an online environment, have that routine of what they can habitually expect each week. We start with learning objectives that highlight the key ideas that they need to be understanding each week. I provide a written, or in some cases, even a video overview of the module, not really telling them what the reading's about. They need to do that themselves, but telling them kind of the key ideas and controversies so they have a context as they're beginning to read that. Again, the assigned readings, then supplementary links to really credible, videos on YouTube or other media hosts, that are not propaganda and do provide, some rigorously vetted content about these polarizing subjects. Then there's an automated quiz to make sure they've done their multiple choice quiz to make sure they've done their reading and that they have a clear idea of what's going on. Then the content discussions I've already described and the writing workshops that I've already described. And I mean, I kind of encourage anybody to follow my format for themselves and to create curriculum for themselves using this. But fortunately, for those of you that are looking for online curriculum, I have 3 e-textbook titles by Kendall Hunt on these subjects that are already ready to go out of the box, right? So I've got a e-textbook on philosophy of sports, one on philosophy of war, and one on the philosophy of sex and love. so that, once students have their access code, everything they need, from the discussions to the automated multiple choice to the video links to the assigned readings, it's all there, ready to go, to help them think more deeply about these subjects. And I modestly hope to overcome some of the polarity and the divisiveness that we're experiencing today. So thank you, Ryan, for giving me the opportunity to talk about these of my courses. And yeah, I'm ready to field some questions from the audience.
Sounds great. Thanks, Albert. What is the average class size in which you utilize this teaching format?
That's a great question, Ryan. I actually developed this format when I first started teaching large enrollment courses, which at my host university is defined as over 100 students. So for any of these classes, I've had as many as 120 students. I think you could do it with much more. And I've also used this format with classes that are much smaller, right? So I think as long as you got 30 students or more in a class, you should probably be able to use this and get kind of the critical mass of participation by students on the discussion boards. If it goes a little lower, that's fine too, but you might have to, as an instructor, engage in a little bit, engage in the discussions a little bit more to keep those going and help students to really dig deeper into the subjects.
Great. Another question. How do you facilitate classroom discussions like all of us have been doing when teaching online? How do you do that in an online format?
That's really great, Ryan. And I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. I think what we're learning because of the mass migration to online is that some of us learn really well in those settings and some of us learn better face to face. And even when we do well online, some of us get a lot out of Zoom classes. Some of us get a lot out of discussion posts. I personally was the student that sat quietly in a face-to-face discussion throughout the whole term. And so my real engagement with the course was through my writing. And I think a lot of instructors out there probably have had that experience, is that your best students are actually ones that say the least in class because they're listening and being thoughtful. And it's not that we don't love our students that are really good at always raising their hands and asking questions, but they understand a certain amount of the gamesmanship of being in a classroom and sort of performing in front of their peers. So with regards to stimulating good discussions online, I think there's a variety of options. I personally, with my content discussions, I read all of my students' posts, but I never actually directly post on them because I think it's very important that that be a space for them, a laboratory, so to speak, for them to work out their own ideas. Time and time again, when I've tried to engage in a content discussion, I find that as soon as I say something, the discussion stops. It's like the authority has spoken and there's no further conversation about the issue. So I prefer, if I'm going to discuss the content, to do that in a Zoom session, or I've used this sort of format in traditional hybrid courses where we'll meet once a week in person. I think it's better for me to engage in those discussions when we're assembled as a whole class through Zoom or in the classroom. That way I can highlight student work. I can say oh, well, Ryan had a really good post about this and it seemed to generate a lot of discussion. Would you be willing to explain what your point of view was? And maybe a few others can chime in to help us, review it and maybe take the discussion further. Another strategy I've used is to actually sort of write weekly video or written blog posts. So I kind of summarize the discussion, highlight the 3 that were the most interesting, and kind of provide either answers to questions that came up a lot, or I propose other questions for them to consider. I find that's much more effective because you really got to let students do their own work with regards to discussing these issues. Otherwise, the minute you open your mouth, they're thinking oh, that's the right answer for the test and I'm going to write that down. It doesn't matter what my opinion is. Now, in the writing workshops, I'm different. That is where it's really good for a professor to get involved because I can refer them to good sources. I can help them to narrow their thesis down. I can help them to clarify terms that they bring up in their abstract proposal that needs some more clarification. That's a good place to get involved. But, that's what I think is kind of the beauty of the way I do my course. I really change it up from time to time. And I think anybody who uses these e-textbooks will find that there's a lot of flexibility there, to engage in in-class discussion. But once they do it, they've got this whole week's worth of content and activity that their students have been doing that they're then bringing into that live discussion.
Sure. That's great. And this question's pretty related to that. Do you allow, like, this instructor really wants to incorporate current events into their course? Do you leave gaps in your course syllabus for these new cases, or do you swap out existing ones? How do you integrate new cases throughout the semester?
Oh, I think that's great. And one of the cool things about the Kindle Hunt e-textbook format is, like, since these are hosted through the Kindle Hunt website, you could easily take your learning management system and host, like, post in, say, the announcements feed. Hey, here's a really interesting article I saw on this subject. What I've created a discussion board on the learning management system where we can discuss, anyone who wants can discuss this further, and then kind of go deeper with it in that regard. I think that's probably the best way. Or, you could get in there on the discussion posts, maybe after they're done, and post a link to it, saying that this, for students who want to know more, this is a particularly good option. Or I think that would be the perfect thing to bring up in a synchronous live discussion, either over Zoom or the classroom. So it's like, yeah, so we talked about this issue of gender inclusion on the discussion boards. Here's a headline from, the news of where this is going on now. How is this similar or different to what's going on before? So it's giving them another opportunity to take the same material and apply it again, right, to, another issue that's going on. Truthfully, I've been writing these books over the past year, and, there have constantly been updates, even as I'm writing, where these continue to be in the news, whether, it's like with Colin Kaepernick and him finally getting validation from, the NFL management for his right to, use his celebrity as a platform from social justice, to, as I said, the stuff that is going on with regards to trans athletes in student sports in high school, as well as college and the Olympics. I was writing the philosophy of war textbook while the insurrection was going on. So I was literally writing my section on cyber warfare and propaganda, and how, this is creating a world where we literally live in different realities. And that part of the goals by bad actors who are doing that propaganda is to actually get people to go from the digital space to real spaces and begin engaging in, political activism that can be very, very destructive and threatening. So yeah, there's always opportunities to bring things in from current events, but you're going to be doing it with a whole week's worth of activities sort of already in play, so that your students have already gotten a chance to practice.
Do you have a formal process for collecting these cases, or is it just kind of just general observation? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's general observation. You got to be smart. I mean, I'm on social media too, and I know that those algorithms have traced my likes and are more likely to show me content that reinforces my biases and assumptions. So, I try to do a little bit of vetting with people I disagree with to see, like, if they think it's a credible article, or is there anything I'm missing before I bring that into the classroom. The last thing I want to do is be what intelligence officials call a useful idiot, which is someone who passes on propaganda or misinformation and therefore affects more people. In fact, that's actually the topic for the content discussion during cyber warfare. The question is, am I a useful idiot? Have I ever passed on, right, propaganda or misinformation? And the answer is pretty much all of us probably have at some point, right?
Sure.
So I'm really glad someone from the audience is asking that question. And you know, you all may be more of an expert on it than me. You know, think about that consciously. What do you do to vet information and articles before you share them with your students? And then share that, write that down and share that information with your students, right? So that they're just getting another set of sort of critical thinking and analysis tools to equip them for dealing with this really strange world, you know, that we're living in many ways, right?
Albert, I'm going to butcher this question, but I'm going to try doing it. I am not a philosophy person, but do you provide a general overview of utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, and rights ethics in these courses?
You know, I do. And like, obviously, those are major normative theories of philosophy. Um, I'll share one of my biases as a pragmatist and someone who believes in the philosophies of William James and John Dewey. I think we spend way too much time on normative theories. You know, Dewey has a good point. He says, you know, usually virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology, they usually agree on the same thing. So we're actually, you know, on what the ethical thing to do is. So we're actually only looking at those few cases where, you know, I mean, and it's like the trolley problem type stuff, you know, where the consequences versus whether or not we have the right to harm people, you know, like get kind of pushed to these situations. It's not to say that's not important, though. I mean, students do need this background, and I have other ethics courses where I certainly go to it in depth. But I present that information actually in the introduction. You know, it's not really hard for a student to understand what virtue ethics is. It's not that difficult for a student to understand what consequentialism and utilitarianism is. And there's so many people online who already teach that stuff really, really well. So I consider that really just the sort of things that get discussed in the introductory module, you know, and there's multiple choice questions on that. There's links to those videos that I've referenced, you know, just sort of helping, because I think we can cover that relatively quickly. And usually a student has already taken an intro to ethics course before they're taking an applied ethics course. So there's definitely resources for that in there. But I think, you know, students want to start applying those theories, you know, rather than thinking about the minutia of them. I mean, we as philosophers, we have all kinds of fun, you know, talking about these issues. But I mean, let's be honest, that's one of the reasons why people, like normal people, get frustrated with philosophers, is because we're always geeking out about those theories. So yes, it's definitely in the textbook, but it's front loaded at the beginning. If you don't, you know, I think there's more than enough for what students need to be able to use that content productively throughout the course. But there's also plenty of space for an individual instructor to add a little bit more along the way, you know, if that's what they think they need to do. Yeah.
Sure, sure. This question, I'm intrigued at your answer on this one too, just in life in general, let alone teaching a course. How might you handle a student's position that you may find abhorrent regarding sexuality, race, or any other number of stances? How do you do that? What's an effective way to address that?
You know, and that is an ongoing question. I'm going to first, you know, take a pose of Socratic humility there, right? I think we're always learning how to do that better. I've been on the student conduct committee of my university, so, you know, we've talked about, you know, I've had a lot of trainings on, you know, what's hate speech versus what's free expression. You know, the truth is, we as instructors, it's actually a little bit more important for us to maintain a safe space for our students to learn in than it is for freedom of expression, right? Because I mean, technically it is, even though it may be a public university, it's not a public space that our students are in, you know, they're paying to be there. So, you know, I think first and foremost, the issue is to keep the focus on safety of students, right? I have in 15 years of online teaching, it's very rare, but I have had one or two episodes where students have, you know, done hate speech or threatening things. I want to just kind of reassure instructors that that's more the exception than the rule. So what are we more likely to encounter? Well, we're more likely to encounter somebody who comes from a very thick tradition, and maybe a religious one or something like that, that really has a clear worldview. I have a lot of sympathy for people who come from those backgrounds. I came from a very conservative background, although I may or may not, it's not about me, but I mean, I understand where the student is coming from in that regard. You shouldn't invalidate, their cultural experiences either, but you should help them to understand where the rhetoric they're using, the point of view they're using, like this can be very problematic. Like this is making people uncomfortable. This is, has maybe historically been used to marginalize or worse certain people, right? And that they may or may not really understand the full implications of what they're putting forward. I'm actually more likely to see stuff like this popping up on final papers, because students who do have extreme positions, they're usually cagey enough to like not present it full forward, like in the public discussions. And so, for me, what I try to do is always make the grading process about objective things like the structure of their arguments, the evidence that they're using. And then I try to engage the student in like, okay, so this idea that you're putting forward has historically been been supported certain nationalist or supremacist ideas that are really problematic, or that nobody, there's really no scientific evidence for an essentialist view on gender, because of this reason here or that reason there, or race, and I start to, as best as I can, deprogram them from some of those assumptions. And finally, have faith in your students. While, we want to protect them, and it's not their job to provide diversity seminars for their peers, the students who do have more extreme or challenging positions, I again and again find that my other students will engage them before I get a chance to do, and they do it in a way that's so much better than me. And, as the father of a teenager, I can tell you the kids don't necessarily listen to me near as much as they listen to their peers, right? And so from my perspective, that's really why we have to be courageous and have these challenging discussions, because they need to learn how to work this out from themselves, right? So there is a time and a place for intervening. If it is particularly egregious, you get in touch quickly with your student life department and whatever support systems you have in that regard. But quite often, this is what the university is a time to do. It's a time to explore your own ideas, to encounter people who are different from you. And there's going to be these times where your biases or your ignorance or, the perspective from whence you came are going to come into some kind of conflict. And we just need to make sure that our students are doing that safely and productively, right? Rather than avoiding it all, which is easy to do, so I say be courageous, trust your students, and then when necessary, speak to the students outside of class, or if absolutely necessary, because it's, something threatening, go and talk to the appropriate people on your campus.
Awesome. Do you have time for two more quick questions?
Oh yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah, they've been coming in, and I want to assure all the attendees that Dr. Spencer will be providing his email address as well if you want to take these conversations offline. So in the Who I Am part of your courses, do you explain some analysis of the human being?
That's a good question. I think it would depend on the particular class, so I'm not offering a course on human nature per se, but, that's an important part of philosophy. And so that comes up at different times. It might come up in specific modules. So, for gender identity, for example, in fact, this is the reason why I cover Plato's Symposium. The ancient Greeks had a completely different view on heteronormativity or the lack thereof, or understanding the way that genders were expected to interact. So spending some time with that and helping students to understand it and see both, some students find inspirations in a culture that was very positive about this ritualized form of bisexuality. At the same time, the Greek notion of pederasty clearly violates consent and has like a lot of huge problems with it, right? So that's a good way of engaging this question about human nature, because here we're looking at a great work of ancient literature, and we're seeing that while we've inherited so much from the Greeks, for good or bad, in really world civilization, let's not leave out the Bactrians and the influence of them on the East. Nevertheless, these views are constantly changing. And so, we have to think about them more deeply. And it shows, I think it's the best way of showing to students how, for example, sexual identity and gender norms are very socially constructed, right? So that would go into this notion of human nature, because, we're saying that there isn't something that essentially makes one male or female or necessarily gay or straight, that it may be a much more complicated way of looking at this. Another topic in Sex and Love that deals with that is, late in one of the content discussions, I present a TED Talk by a speaker who questions sort of the born this way point of view with regards to one's sexual orientation. So I grew up in the 90s, and I remember the conversations people were having about whether sexual orientation was a choice or was you were born this way. And I mean, that was a very important conversation to have. And I'm glad the born this way side won. But, sexual identity is much more complicated than that, and our students are starting to recognize that and feeling more comfortable claiming to be bisexual, for example, or pansexual, right? Meaning that they're more attracted to the person rather than a certain gender presentation. So, and that kind of means that, perhaps they're not heterosexual in the very rigid way. We've been thinking about this for a generation or two now, but in a thinking about their sexual identity in a much more complex way, right? So to answer that person's question, there are points where I have specific conversations about that, but they're more likely to pop up along the way when a conversation gets to something that really is about human nature. Another example in sports would be the issue of ability, right? Now, I'm not wanting to, undermine or minimize, people who have registered disabilities and need accommodations because, they have different abilities and may not be able to engage in the world the way as others. But so much of ability is relative to the context you're in. So, being short might be a disability in a lot of occasions, but if you're a horse jockey, that's a true asset, right? Likewise, we think it would, most of us think about how great it would be to be as tall and imposing, right, as like an NBA center or something like that. And definitely, like, having that body enables them to be able to have the career that they do. But man, I can't imagine how tough it would be to be like 7 feet tall and have to find clothes that fit and a car that you can actually fit in, and to have to get an extra large king size bed to sleep in, and all the problems that come with that. So there are situations where, we shouldn't really be talking about an essential point of view on what it means to be abled, or an essential point of view on what it means to be normal or to be straight or to be gay, but understanding, that these are very socially constructed and relative to context. But even where there might be specific facts that are scientific, there can be a lot of ambiguity. So I'm sorry, I keep thinking of examples of this as I go along. In the introduction to philosophy of sex, in that content discussion, I have a TED talk from a woman. She identifies as being female, but she's born intersexed, right? I mean, we don't talk about it, the reality of intersexed people enough when it comes to our discussion of sexuality and gender. There are people who are biologically born with ambiguous genitalia, or they have, an extra X or Y chromosome. There's no binary when it comes to physical sex. We are not simply male or female. There are a significant number of the population who are in the middle. So we've got to honor that, right? And in our notions of thinking about what human nature is and thinking about our ethics, we've got to understand that because of the way that evolution works, because of mutations and every generation essentially being than the last, there isn't a fixed human nature. There might be generalities or family resemblances or things of that nature, but we're all unique individuals. And so that's in the background, that is discussed at discrete points, right? But still, I wouldn't say it's a focus of the course, but it is certainly an important, like, minor background issue that continues to come up.
Sure. One final question. Do you give students grading criteria for things such as classroom discussion participation? Is there a specific criteria that you use and that students are aware of?
Well, I put that information in my syllabus. It's not in the e-textbook because, again, if anyone chooses to use one of those and adopt it for their courses, I don't want my expectations on assignments that's written throughout there interfering with your expectations as an instructor. But personally, I actually grade discussions on participation. So for a student's first post, I give them, there's a little bit of qualitative grading. I give them up to 2 points, which they usually get. The only time I would give them 1 point on their first post is if it was really short or if it was really vague, as a little bit of a stick, so that on future posts, they're being substantial, but they're being good participants. And then I just grade them and give them 1 point per response to their students. And so they can earn 5 points overall, 2 on their first post discussion, and 3 on their responses to their fellow students. And that actually works out quite well. I mean, there's, if I may be a philosopher here, I mean, there's going to be the free rider problem. And that's, again, where you as an instructor should be reading your discussion posts and maybe emailing a student if their reply is devolving down to, yeah, that's a great idea, I never thought about that. I mean, that's not really advancing the discussion, right? In fact, one way I guard against that is I encourage students to end their reply with another student with a follow-up question. That way, they're always providing an opportunity for either the original poster to say more or for another student to say more, and to keep that conversation going further. And it works pretty well. I mean, usually in any given discussion, I'm going to have about 5 where students get somewhere between, I'd say around 7 or so responses back and forth. And those are going to be your real standout ones for the course. Yeah, but even the others are still hitting kind of like a 3 to 6 areas. So they're having some conversations about things. But that in and of itself becomes a bit of a corrective, because the reason those students are getting more discussion, it may be because they have a more interesting title. Again, it's the social media era and we're victim to that. But quite often it's not. Quite often it's because they're either articulating the problems in a clearer way, or the questions that their fellow students are asking is helping them to go more deeply and consider things. And so it's just really interesting to watch how, if you give students a space to do this, they kind of come up with this on their own and really start doing quite a good job. Yeah.
That's really helpful. This has been fun. This has been a great time, Dr. Spencer. I appreciate your time. I've learned a lot. I'm judging from the number of questions, a lot of people are intrigued with this approach as well. So thank you.
Oh yeah, no, you're welcome. And like Ryan said, for those who have registered, you have my contact information. Feel free to shoot me an email. I mean, my summertime is starting, so the rate might be a little slow, but I will get to them eventually. And I'm just so grateful that you guys turned up to hear more about my courses and my work. It's really gratifying to be able to share what I've learned through trial and error with others, especially now as our online and digital presence is becoming a more and more important part of what we do.
As a final note, I invite you to join us for future webinars such as this one here. We're hosting a webinar on designing a course for first year seminar next week on June 29th, and tips to help you communicate with students in ways that work. That one's on July 29th. To learn more and reserve your spot for these free learning opportunities, visit he.kendallhunt.com/events. As Albert mentioned, in the coming days, you'll receive a copy of this recording and contact information for him. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.